This past August, I was going through my syllabus for voice lessons because it is inevitable that I'm going to want to change something. And as I was reading it, I came across this sentence. At the end of each lesson, I will tell you what I want you to work on in preparation for your next lesson. Ew, David. I don't know how that sentence had escaped my attention for so long because it had been in my syllabus for years. And while I'm pretty sure I unfortunately took that very teacher-centered stance in the early part of my vocation, I certainly do not now. I ended up rewriting the sentence to read, at the end of each lesson, we will come to a consensus about what to work on in preparation for your next lesson. It's a small change, yes, but it's a pretty big shift in tone. Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my new podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my forthcoming book of the same title, which will be released by Routledge Press in summer 2025. Today, we're going to talk about the differences between teacher-centered and student-centered learning, and why student-centered learning is both more equitable for the student and actually supports teacher well-being. This week's guests are Dr. Marisa Lee Naismith, who teaches at Queensland Conservatorium at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, and Dr. Travis Sherwood, who is Associate Professor and Voice Area Coordinator at San Diego State University. More on both of them in just a moment. But first, let's define teacher-centered and student-centered learning. Teacher-centered learning is an approach to teaching that places the teacher as the director of learning and is mainly accomplished by lecture, repetitive practice of basic skills, and constructive feedback. As we discussed in the last episode of the podcast, the teacher-centered model of learning was born in part out of the master-apprentice model. Brazilian educator and researcher Paulo Freire referred to teacher-centered learning as the banking model, meaning that teachers would actually deposit their knowledge in the student. Musicologist Elwood Colohan explains why this can be problematic for student growth. He writes, like the apprenticeship system, banking education discourages critical interrogation of the nature of things, including those things pertaining to the relationship between teacher and student. And, like the apprenticeship system, banking education is arranged in such a way that one of its outcomes will invariably be to reproduce the relationships and conditions that brought it about in the first place. It's a fantastic reminder, end quote. According to the Greenwood Dictionary of Education, student-centered learning, by contrast, is an instructional approach in which students influence the content, activities, materials, and pace of learning. This learning model places the student in the center of the learning process. The instructor provides students with opportunities to learn independently from each other and coaches them in the skills they need to do so effectively. When properly implemented, student-centered instruction can lead to increased motivation to learn, greater retention of knowledge, deeper understanding, and more positive attitudes toward the subject being taught. And we may often think about student-centered learning as being a modern-day buzzword, but the truth is that its roots are grounded in the work of John Dewey at the beginning of the 20th century. He wrote that learning should emerge from students' observations and experiences. Student-centered teaching, however, requires us to forsake the hierarchical structures that may have been present when we were students. And this vulnerable posture might even breed the desire to poke holes in such an approach. Educators Celia Euler and Joe Becker write, there is a danger that the idea of sharing authority is itself ultimately a power move, that it conceals some deeper way in which the teacher imposes, some deeper way in which the teacher maintains control, irrespective of students' agendas. While we acknowledge this danger, we also feel that this question can be a way of avoiding responsibility, a way of maintaining that only two positions are the authoritarian position and the position of abdicated authority. We deny this. We persevere in our attempts to theorize and practice from a different place. With that framework in place, it is now my great pleasure to introduce you to today's guests, plural. First, Dr. Marisa Lee Naismith is an acclaimed vocalist, educator, researcher, mentor, and author with 45 plus years in the CCM industry, who currently teaches voice at Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University. She holds a PhD on CCM singing, voice pedagogy, and has presented her work internationally at leading conferences, universities, and conservatories. Marisa has co-authored peer-reviewed journal articles and published her book, Singing Contemporary Commercial Music Styles, a Pedagogical Framework. As host of the A Voice and Beyond podcast, she empowers others to thrive personally and professionally. Her podcast recently hit 1 million downloads. And in 2023, Marisa launched a coaching and mentoring program to help performers clarify artistic identity, build confidence, and create sustainable practices, turning their passions into impactful careers. Baritone Travis Sherwood serves as Associate Professor of Voice, Director of SDSU Opera Theater, and Voice Area Coordinator on the faculty of San Diego State University School of Music and Dance. Dr. Sherwood is an active performer on the operatic concert and recital stages. Offstage, Dr. Sherwood frequently presents at national and international conferences on student-centered pedagogy, artistic literacy, voice pedagogy, and vocal literature. Dr. Sherwood holds a Doctor of Musical Arts and Master of Music degree from the University of Southern California Thornton School of Music and a Bachelor of Music degree from Westminster Fire College. In addition to being incredibly thoughtful pedagogues and teachers, they have also become dear colleagues and friends to me, and I'm so grateful to research and learn alongside them. Marisa and Travis, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having us, David. It's such a pleasure to hang with two of my best buddies and very smart pedagogues.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to talk shop with friends. It's great to be here.
So one of our favorite subjects is student-centeredness in the voice studio. And so I was just wondering if maybe as a little warm-up for us, we could talk a little bit about, maybe an anecdote or a story about why you find student-centeredness to be so powerful for student growth in the voice studio. Marisa, can we start with you?
So I began having lessons as part of a program later in life, and I had already had a 35-year career as a pop rock singer, quite a healthy, sustainable career. I mean, an example of that was I was doing 11 gigs a week, and I did that for 3 months without any vocal issues. So I went into those lessons having had this career, but also a very strong vocal identity. And this teacher began to question the way that I sang, my aesthetic and stylistic choices that I was making, and started to tear my voice apart. And not at any time through those lessons asked me, how did I feel about the work that she was doing? Or I said the work that this person was doing, and how I felt during those lessons. And so when I started having my voice ripped apart and this teacher imposing their own aesthetic preferences on me, I had to do a lot of manipulating to create those sounds. So not only was I not identifying with the sounds that I was creating, but they didn't feel right within my own body. I started to become so uptight and so tense that I was literally choking when I sang, and I couldn't recognize the voice anymore. And I started to feel like an imposter, and I started to question all those years of performing, and were audiences maybe feeling sorry for me? How did I have such a successful career, and was I really a bad singer, and how embarrassing? So I started to question everything around my voice and around my career, I was told by this teacher, these are the sounds you should be making. This is what sounds good. This is way better. And this is how you make these sounds. So it's not a story that I really share, but I wanted to share it here on this platform because we are talking about student-centeredness. And I have since had students come to me who have had similar experiences. And I want students out there, although anyone out there, not just the teachers, but any students out there listening, knowing or feeling these feelings that I was having and not knowing how to describe them, that there are teachers out there who are student-centered. And if you're feeling a sense of fear, or if you're feeling controlled, or you're feeling a loss of vocal autonomy, there are other people out there who are feeling the same. If you are feeling that you're not experiencing any growth, it could be that you are dealing with a teacher who is teacher-centered and essentially self-centered.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Marissa. That's really powerful. And, you know, what I heard in your sharing of that is that, this teacher, not only were they having you sing in a way that was not authentic to your journey, but that in fact you were gaslit to look back on your previous singing and question it.
Absolutely.
And that's it's just a reminder of how powerful teachers can be in positive and negative ways, right, in the lives of our students. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Because the job that we do as singing teachers, I look at it as a privilege. I don't look at it as my right that I have studied this thing so I can now go out and teach. It is a privilege because essentially our voice is our unique footprint on this earth. It makes up part of that unique footprint. So we are essentially not just working with a person's voice, but we're also working with what makes a part of their identity. So it is a huge responsibility.
yeah. One and before I segue to Travis, I also just want to say that as a CCM teacher too, there is obviously a huge amount of importance placed on authenticity, right? That is. I mean,
Absolutely.
I think that's true of all singing, but I think that CCM music, pop rock music, is really it's artist centered in a much
It
different
is.
way than musical theater and certainly classical, right? Which is composer centers, right? So
Yes, yes,
so all the
yes.
more reason, right?
Exactly. We cannot impose our own aesthetic choices on singers across CCM styles because those aesthetic choices are delivered with an emotional intent. And there are times where students make sounds that are really unconventional. And as a teacher, we have to say to ourselves, it's okay. It is okay. That is a part of what they're doing. And isn't it beautiful that they allowed that space to make those sounds? What a beautiful gift that we're giving to those students to allow them to create sounds that feel true and authentic and that they are in a safe space where they feel vulnerable enough to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Travis, what comes to mind for you when you think about the power of student-centeredness within your voice studio?
I mean, I've seen countless examples of how a student-centered philosophy in action in the voice studio has just resulted in students finding parts of themselves in their voice, in ways that have even come to shock me. It's really just, it's like such, as Marisa said, it really is a privilege that we have. But if I were to think of one anecdote, it actually would not be in my voice studio, but it would be the first time that I brought up student-centered philosophy in a pedagogy class that I was teaching. And this to me was a really transformative time. It was when I had a first draft of the second article that I wrote for the JOS on student-centered learning and history of master-apprentice and all that. And so I was making the syllabus for the class, and I kept going back and forth about, like, I took several pedagogy classes throughout my education, and we never discussed philosophy of teaching in any of the pedagogy classes. And so I was like, well, does this sound conventional? I don't know. Should I go there? Is it okay for me to like have this discussion? Because of course the class is populated with not only students who study with me, but also students who study with colleagues. And am I going to be treading on, people's toes a little bit here? And I thought, you know what, this is a really important part of my teaching and in my research, obviously. And so I think that this is something valid. And so I'm going to carve out some time in this undergraduate pedagogy class to discuss philosophy. And so I gave them both the first article that I wrote for the JOS and the draft of the article that I had written to read and plan to have discussion. And these students, they were on fire in these discussions. I mean, they just lit up, and it was inspiring to hear what they had to say. Some of them in a way of like, I've experienced student-centeredness in lessons, and this is what I found that was helpful. Others, I've experienced teacher-centeredness. I didn't know that's what it was called, but this is how I found it sort of destructive to my own learning and to my own singing. But it was thrilling to see the way that they could recognize these practices once you put a name to them, right? And they could recognize the importance of a philosophy grounding your pedagogy, right? And so a lot of the students in this class, we had performance majors, we had music education majors, and it's been really beautiful now. I mean, this was several years ago, and so several of these students are now out teaching in K-12 schools, they're choral directors, and I'm still in contact with them, and they talk about how they think about student-centered philosophy in their teaching and how they can use that in their choral classrooms or when they're working one-on-one with students. And to me, like that's the work right there, right? It's like we're in a profession, especially in the Western classical world, we are in a profession that is grounded in that teacher-centered master-apprentice model. And we're working now, hundreds of years later, to really try and like just break that down and figure out how can we kind of turn that on its head and become more student-centered, and what can that look like in a lesson. And so the way that we need to do that is not only in our own teaching, but through inspiring the next generation of teachers to embrace that model from the very beginning of their career, right? And so that is so exciting to me, is to see these young teachers out there thinking about this stuff that maybe, I mean, I'll admit, like I thought about student-centeredness when I was first starting to teach, but I don't know that I really put it into practice until later into the career.
Yeah, I just amen to everything you said, basically. I mean, and certainly this idea that, the art and practice side, the philosophy side of pedagogy often goes unmentioned, right? Articles here, an article here, right? We've certainly seen in journals, which is wonderful, and we're grateful for them. But that's exactly what made me want to write this book, and think about like what is like because we've all seen how, yes, technical help is of tremendous value, but we've also seen how student-centeredness and other
Mm.
frameworks help students thrive just as much as those other technical frameworks, right? And so I just want to underscore that. I think that's so powerful. So we understand what teacher-centered versus student-centeredness
Mhm.
is. I've defined that at the beginning of the podcast, but can we talk a little bit about what does student-centeredness look like specifically within different parts of the lesson?
Every morning I fill out a journal. And in my journal, it has my intentions for the day. And the days that I teach, the first thing that I write is to listen to my students. You know, you learn a lot by listening. And when my students come in, the first thing that I ask them is, how are you? How has your week been? How are your studies going if they're a university student? Or how is work? By listening to the answers to those simple questions, you can learn so much about where a student is at. The next thing that we as student-centered teachers need to do is to be flexible. Don't teach every student the same set of exercises or warm-ups. Warm them up according to what they need. So you can base your lessons around, okay, if a student says that they're stressed, well, ask them, how would you like to warm up today? Would you like to warm up? Do you feel that you may like to just do some breath work? You know, just get them on the ground, do some deep breathing, calm down their nervous system. So then you can work with them, because no, you can't work with someone who is so tied up in a knot. You're not going to get anywhere with that student. Or they may have already warmed up. They may be feeling great and they may have already warmed up. Well, don't warm them up because they're already warmed up. So be flexible in the way that you approach the start of the lesson based on what they're telling you. Once they're warmed up, or if they're already warmed up, go into the repertoire and based on and let them sing through the whole song, and then ask them, what did you feel was maybe problematic for you? Was there anything that was a challenge? What went well? What did you feel was really working for you? And then work at the exercises around those challenges, around any obstacles that they came across within their repertoire or in their practice sessions during the week. When it comes to repertoire, allowing students to have input into what they sing. If a student's not enjoying what they're singing, they are not going to practice. So allowing them to choose repertoire, and then you as a teacher, especially as CCM teacher, there is no excuses for a singer singing repertoire in keys that are not appropriate for them. If a song needs to be slowed down, sped up, if the version of the song doesn't work, find another version. If there's one note in the whole song that is unattainable, but everything else is sitting in their tessitura, improvise the note if they're really struggling with it. Always setting your students up for success and not for failure is key.
That idea of listening, taking in what the student is doing and what they want to work on. I think it's so important, not only one, because it's student-centered, but also because I find it just gives them resilience in the practice room when they're on their own, because they've already talked themselves through like, oh yeah, this isn't working. I need to do this, right? And to be able to, I think, use a lesson to get them to understand that they're flying the plane, right? And so, yes, of course,
Exactly.
we're there to support and to offer thoughts. Or what if you tried this? Would that, you want to do this? Great. What's going to get you there? All right, you want to try that? Did that work? Oh, it didn't. Okay. Well, what if you tried this, right? It's having that curiosity, I think, is so necessary
Exactly.
because I find especially students of Generation Z, resilience is a real issue
Mm.
for some, not of course
100%.
not everyone. And so I want to lift that up, Marissa, because I think it's so smart to kind of speak on that. Travis, what can you add your pearls of wisdom to that?
Well, I don't know. For me, especially when I first started kind of moving over or trying to make these adjustments as a teacher and figure out how can I really take this philosophy that I have championed and put it into practice, it was small changes, right? It comes and it starts in small changes of students come in and I say, what exercise have you been enjoying this week? And the way that they answer that question provides me with a ton of information. And so a lot of times what they will do is they will sing the exercise rather than trying to explain it. They'll just say, I like this one, and they sing it. Great. Whatever key they sang it in, that is the key that we are going to start with. We're going to start with that exercise, and then we're going to move up and down and all over the place with that exercise and figure out where we are that day vocally, and then, see what do we want to work on in this exercise? What made you choose this one? Why have you been enjoying this lately? What has this been unlocking for you in your process, right? Depending on how they answer that question, that then catapults us into whatever next exercise is going to be. And we go forward from there, right? And it's important that I do spend a lot of time at the piano, and that's a difference between, I think, CCM and classical for sure. And so, but when I'm at the piano, I always have to be really conscious about how I am accompanying exercises. I find that a lot of teachers will just double the melody of the exercise. And at that point, the student's not really in control of many aspects of the exercise anymore. The teacher is. The teacher's in control of tempo. They're in control of how much time the student has to breathe in between iterations of the exercise. They're in control of articulation very much at the piano. The piano, being a very percussive instrument, can certainly inspire different types of articulation, whether it's what we're going for or not. So I find having flexible accompaniment at the piano during exercises is so important. Just simple 1-5-7-1 patterns, or tremoloing tonic, or even sometimes just having them sing the exercise a cappella, can be very, very beneficial as well. So I think, in many ways, what does it look like? It looks like a conversation, right? It looks like a conversation between two people who have equal value in that conversation, right? It's not a setting of one person telling another person what we are going to do next and how we are going to do it, stopping them and telling, nope, that's not right, right? We're not looking at singing on a binary of right and wrong, but instead just kind of working our way through this exploration of finding an efficient process for what we do as singers. And so what we're looking for is how can we develop an efficient process for what it is that we do. And we know that as singers, this is a lifelong journey, that as your body changes and as you learn more about yourself and you learn more about your art form, that the way that you approach this process is going to continue to evolve over time. And so you really want the students to take that and then go to the practice room and engage with that exploration on their own. One of the first things I say to my new students is, you don't learn how to sing in a voice lesson. You learn how to teach yourself how to sing in a voice lesson. You learn how to sing in the practice room. And so I think that's a key element of the student-centered philosophy, is that if you're walking into the lesson expecting to get all of the answers, then it's not how it's going to work, right? You need to figure out how to engage with this. So it's both the teacher and the student embracing this student-centered pedagogy.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think it's like we are guiding our students towards autonomy. We're
Absolutely.
not teaching them. how to become autonomous. We're guiding them towards being autonomous. But I mean, the best thing we can do is be fired as singing teachers, where students
Right.
feel that they can go and do it on their own.
Right.
That's, it's fine. That's what we want. You don't have to keep paying me for the next 20 years. I'm actually paying you to fire me. You're paying me to fire. What? You know what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely.
I need to be
Absolutely.
fired here.
Marissa, you had touched on repertoire, and one of the things I just continue to hold is Brian Montrenach wrote a really great article for JOS, Journal of Singing, talking about the student veto, that really inspired me to have a situation where I may suggest songs to students. I have a situation now where students and I take turns. I'll be like, okay, you choose three post Golden Age songs that you think would be right for you, and I'll choose one of them. And if I veto them, I'll tell you why I'm vetoing them, and then I'll give you
Mm.
three, and then we'll
Hmm.
switch, right? And so they're having to research, which is something I find some of them need some hand holding with, and
Yes.
which is really good. But it's just getting them to realize that yes, of course, that musical theater is based on your essence as a person, much in the same way I think it's true with CCM, right? And
Mm.
so if this isn't setting you on fire, bye, like not interested. There are trillions of songs that we could sing. So let's find the one that really is exciting to you, right?
Really, repertoire selection could be and should be a formative process for both the teacher
Mhm.
and the student, right?
Yes.
Like, I look at it as an opportunity to really learn something about the student and their aesthetics and what interests them. I find that a lot of classical students, especially when they first start, they're intimidated by selecting repertoire, and because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing or whatever. They just feel like, oh, I don't know enough about the canon, so you just pick. But that's an opportunity to ask them tons of questions about, like, do you want to sing a happy song? Do you want to sing a sad song? Do you want to sing a an Italian song? Is there a language preference there? Do you want to sing a song about love? Do you want to sing? Are there composers that you've sung or that you've heard that you really enjoyed? Did you hear something in a studio class or at a Nats competition or something like that that you really liked and you'd like to find something similar to that? And just get them involved in the repertoire selecting process, because ultimately, like Marissa was saying, we're trying to put ourselves out of a job. The ultimate goal is that students will pick their own repertoire at some point in their career and
Yes.
start to understand what makes good repertoire for them, right? Like, why does this piece fit their voice well and another piece does not?
What you're both speaking on, I think is important. It's, student-centeredness is not saying, here you go, kid, figure it out. It's saying, hey, let's have a conversation about what you
Mm.
want to do, what types of things excite you, what types of things you don't want to do, right? And then offering up some suggestions, having them offer up some suggestions. And the other thing is that I just want to hit home for all of us and our listeners is that student-centeredness is not just good for the student, it's also great for us as teachers because it offers our days tremendous variety. It helps keep us in, oh my gosh, I love musical theater, but if I had to teach the same musical theater song day in and day out, I would lose my ever-loving mind, right? I
Mm.
have students that are bringing in oh, I've never heard of this Cantor and Ebb song. How did I miss this? Right?
Yes.
That's what brings me alive, right? Is when students are engaging in something that they're really excited about. It brings us energy, right? Which I think is really important to remember. Yes, of course, it's to the benefit of the student, but it also benefits
Mm.
us. I wanted to talk about, at the beginning of the podcast, I shared this story about looking at my syllabus and finding this very teacher-centered wording of this sentence that it had been in there for years. And it wasn't the way that I taught, but I just, for some reason, hadn't kind of gotten my act together to rewrite it. And as I said, this is teaching is a practice, right? And so I'm wondering, in the spirit of generosity, if there's something that comes to you about how maybe you've moved from a teacher-centered to a more student-centered approach. There's a certain anecdote or a certain thing that you've done,
Mhm.
because I have learned from both of you as we've talked about this, and I know our podcast listeners will as well.
I can tell you kind of the moment, right, when I realized that this philosophy that I knew that I had was not really effectively going into practice. And I remember it vividly. I was at a Nats conference in probably my second or third year of my full-time teaching. And one of my students, fabulous young soprano, came up to me and she was like, "Dr. Sherwood, will you warm me up?" Because she was competing in the competition. And I was like, "Well, I mean, I can help you, sure, but certainly you feel comfortable warming yourself up for this competition." And she was like, "Oh no, I couldn't warm up for a performance without you." And like my stomach just dropped, and I thought to myself, I was like, "What am I doing? Like, what is wrong with this? Where this fantastic young singer who's been studying with me now for at least 2 years at this point doesn't feel comfortable warming herself up for a performance, right? Like we've been going through many exercises over several years, but yet there's this like dependency where she feels like somehow if I'm in the room, her voice is going to function better than if I'm not in the room." And so, of course, I went in the practice room and warmed her up and helped her on that day. And because I wasn't going to leave her high and dry at that competition. But that's when I started really rethinking my practices and trying to think about how can I engage in these lessons. And it started with, particularly in the exercises, the vocal conditioning part of the lesson, like how can I engage in this to where students feel agency to warm themselves up. They feel they can walk into a practice room and not just run through exercises, but also maintain awareness as they're doing it and decide like, all right, these are the sounds that are coming out of my face. I want them to be somewhat different. What adjustments do I need to make right now in order to make, do I need to think about breath? Do I need to think about space? Do I need to think about articulation? Like what do I need to do right now? And what exercise is going to maybe help facilitate that aspect of my process? And so I think that was the moment for me right there. And I started making big changes in the way that I ran at least that part of the lesson. And then that started to go into how I was working in repertoire and selecting repertoire and so forth.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's really
Of course.
powerful.
Yeah.
Marisa, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah. Look, there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. And firstly, it was the way that I think about the voice. And I talked about this earlier, and that our voice is another facet of our unique footprint on this earth, and that makes up the sum of all of us as individuals. It's part of our unique human identity and who we are. It's more than just an instrument. And we have to be very careful in the way that we handle other people's unique footprint and their individuality and their identity, and that we have to respect the voice. And the only way that we can respect other people's voices is if we respect our own voice and ourselves as individuals. And that we have to be in a space ourselves and within ourselves where we check in on ourselves and make sure that we are okay before we can work with other people. And I had a very specific example of this when a few years ago my mum passed away and I had to go and teach 2 weeks afterwards. I was very, very, very vulnerable. And I was doing a lot of work on myself before I went to teach at my job, where all I wanted to do was cry out loud. I was in the depths of the grief. And so I started to do all this work on mindset and being present and being there for the student. And that year, I had the best results from my students that I had ever experienced. My students became the most highly expressive, most vulnerable in their storytelling I had ever had in all the years of teaching. And I truly believe it was because of the work that I was doing myself to make sure that I was present for them, that I was leaving all my biases at the door. We need to be aware of our own biases. We need to know how we feel about ourselves. We can't be self-centered and self-serving when we step into that voice studio. And that time when my mum passed away was such a strong example of what is possible if we truly do that work on ourselves, that we take care of ourselves, that we are emotionally present. We are there for our students. And I always used to say to my students when they first started work with me, look, I have a very specific way of teaching. I'm a little different to other teachers. I don't even know how to put a name to it, but I am a little different to other teachers. And I knew I taught differently to a lot of other teachers. And then when I saw Travis present in Vienna on student-centered learning, he put a name, he gave a name to the way that I teach and what I learned. And this was post my mum's passing. And I thought, that is the difference to what I'm seeing a lot of other teachers do. I'm actually doing a lot of the stuff. I still have a long way to go, but I am actually doing a lot of the stuff that Travis is talking about. And since then, the three of us have spoken about. So thank you, because through you two, I've learned and I've grown and I've become a better teacher through the conversations that we've had and what I've discovered in our journey together.
Thank you so much for making time for this. I just adore you both so much, and I can't wait for more research and more conversations and articles and all the things.
All the things, all of the above.
All the things. Much love to
Yeah,
both
love
of
you guys too. I think we're like the three amigos here.
Yes, agreed.
Absolutely.
One research article I came across notes that student-centered learning occurs when the teacher migrates from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, who views the student not as an empty vessel to be filled with knowledge, but as seekers to be guided along their intellectual development journey. Gosh, I think that is such a beautiful way of putting it. We are guides on the side. Were you taught in a more of a teacher-centered or a student-centered way? And how did that impact your learning, do you think? And did our conversation give you some ways for engaging in a more student-centered approach in voice instruction? Please sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com, or you can find me on the socials. My handle on most platforms is Sisco Songs and Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And please subscribe to this podcast on whatever corner of the interweb you found me. I'll be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks, and I know I have said this each time, but truly, there's some great guests that are coming down the pike, and I do not want you to miss a single episode. More soon. Take care of you.